So last time we introduced the problem of free will and also laid out a sort of map of the different possible positions that one can take on the problem. We did this at the end of the last commentary, distinguishing between incompatibilists who deny that free will is compatible with the deterministic character of the universe, or if you like, they deny that it's possible for there to be free will in a universe that's causally deterministic. And there are three different ways to work out that position: hard determinism, indeterminism, and libertarianism. And then in contrast, we have compatibilists who answer that question in a positive way, in an affirmative way, and there are a couple of ways to flesh out that idea, and we'll get to those eventually. In this commentary, I'm just going to talk very briefly about hard determinism, a little bit more than we've already done, but not a lot, since we've really already laid out this position in introducing the problem initially. But it's worth keeping in mind in terms of thinking about the geography of the issues here. What the sort of general argument for incompatibilism is, the general argument for the idea that there is this fundamental incompatibility between the existence of free will on the one hand and the universe having this deterministic character on the other. And the line of reasoning that takes us to this, or one of the better known lines of reasoning that takes us to this, is what's called the consequence argument. And the consequence argument goes like this. It says, to begin with, that we have free will only if we are, in some intuitive sense, the ultimate sources of our choices. Right? If we only can be thought to be acting freely if our agency can be traced to us as opposed to other kinds of factors, environmental factors, say, the causal history of our behavior. Those are the sorts of things that if they were in charge, we could not be said to be in charge. And if we are not in charge of our behavior, then we cannot be said to have free will. So that's the first point. Second point is that if causal determinism is true, then everything we do is ultimately, if you trace it back far enough, caused by events and circumstances beyond our control, right? So if you think about the history of behavior for an individual, as we mentioned earlier, we can trace everything back to some combination of genes plus environment. If you put those two things together, they determine everything that's going to be relevant to the determination of behavior, and there's nothing left over. So there's no way for human agency to sort of get in there and make some kind of additional contribution. Everything is determined once we take those two things into account. And those two things are not things over which we have any control over. Again, you don't choose who your parents were. Your causal history, the history of your life, is not something that you have any control over either. It's just what happened. So third, if everything we do is ultimately caused by events and circumstances beyond our control, which is, again, what the determinist says, then we cannot be said to be the ultimate sources of our choices. The ultimate sources of our choices are these other things, these things that are beyond our control, these events and circumstances, and so on, about which we have no say. The conclusion that we can derive from this as an intermediate conclusion is that if causal determinism is true, we're not the ultimate sources of our choices, and therefore we are not the ultimate sources of our behavior. And so what follows from this is this ultimate conclusion that if determinism is true, we don't have free will. And that claim is just equivalent to incompatibilism. That's what the incompatibilist says, that causal determinism excludes or precludes the existence of free will. So here's one way of putting the point due to a philosopher named Holbach, who was quite eloquent about this. He said, "Man's life is a line that nature commands him to describe upon the surface of the earth without his ever being able to swerve from it, even for an instant. He is born without his own consent. His organization does in no wise depend upon himself. His ideas come to him involuntarily. His habits are in the power of those who cause him to contract them. He is unceasingly modified by causes, whether visible or concealed, over which he has no control, which necessarily regulate his mode of existence, give the hue to his way of thinking, and determine his manner of acting. So this is the sort of worldview of an incompatibilist who endorses, in addition to this idea of an exclusion between determinism and free will, also endorses the idea that free will is just an illusion. We don't actually have free will. We think we do, but we don't. So we talk about illusions quite a lot in ordinary language. It's worth thinking about sort of specific cases. In psychology, visual illusions are frequently studied by psychologists studying the nature of perception. This is one of my personal favorite examples of a visual illusion or an optical illusion. This is called the checker shadow illusion. If you note, there's this board here, which is divided up into these squares. Note square A and square B appear to be different in color. A looks to be a very dark shade. B looks to be relatively light in color. As a matter of fact, however, A and B are exactly the same color. And this is a demonstration of that fact, indicating that there is no difference in the hue of the square B and the square A. So our visual system is tricked by other features of the stimulus into thinking that these two squares have different shades, but in fact they're precisely the same shade. And no matter how much you think about this and how much you're convinced by the demonstration, you can't get your visual system to recalibrate and, as it were, get you to see it that way. That's sort of what we mean by an illusion in the case of perception. And the suggestion with free will is something comparable to that, namely that though we think of ourselves as having some control over our lives and our behavior and so on, that's an illusion, and it's a very persistent illusion. It's one that really is difficult to make go away, in much the same way the checker shadow illusion is very difficult to make go away, perhaps impossible. And there are good psychological reasons for that, perhaps. If you think about yourself as not having control, as being, as it were, kind of bound to your circumstances and bound to your history, that might be a difficult thing to cope with psychologically. So there might be, reasons that we find it hard to shake the idea, because the truth, as it were, might be just too difficult to work with on a practical level. But Holbach's idea, again, is that that free will is an illusion. It's not a perceptual illusion. It's what we might call an epistemic illusion. So Holbach wrote that it's for want of recurring to the causes that move him, for want of being able to analyze, from not being competent to decompose the complicated motion of his machine, that man believes himself a free agent. So on Holbach's diagnosis, we think of ourselves as having free will, but we don't actually have free will. And what leads us into thinking that we have free will, among other things, is that we simply don't know what the causal history of our choice behavior is. Knowing that causal history would be very, very difficult. It would require, knowing it fully would require perhaps some kind of Laplacian supercognitive competence. So we don't have that. We don't have the ability to trace back the history of our choices and so on. And in virtue of not having that understanding of the causal history, we assume incorrectly, as Holbach thinks at least, that there is no such causal history, that our choices somehow emerge autonomously. They're not dictated by the history of events prior to the choice. Of course, again, Holbach thinks that's wrong, but this is his diagnosis of where the belief in free will comes from, or at least a partial diagnosis. So, again, the general thrust of things here, the general argument for the position here, which is typically referred to as hard determinism, which denies the existence of free will, is this argument. It says, first, if causal determinism is true, then we have no free will. That's, again, the position known as incompatibilism, and earlier we looked at the argument for that, the consequence argument. Second, causal determinism is true, and that leads us to the conclusion that we have no free will. Free will is an illusion. Quite simple argument. And I want to make just a note on the conceptual geography here to make absolutely clear that in looking at the space of choices on the free will issue, hard determinism, the view defended by Holbach, among others, is the only view that we're looking at that actually denies the existence of free will. Every other view on the map endorses the idea of free will in one of two ways. Either it does so by rejecting determinism, like rejecting the idea that the causal determinist thesis about the universe is correct. And there are two views that we can consider that do that. One is called indeterminism, and the other is libertarianism. And they're distinct views. They they involve different sorts of claims, but they both adhere to that idea. These are both incompatibilist views. They think in order to save free will, as they would like to do, you need to give up determinism. Or, and this is a fundamentally different alternative, we can accept determinism, this is B, but reject the idea that determinism rules out free will. So in that, what we're doing there, of course, is denying the incompatibility of causal determinism with free will. And this view, not too surprisingly, is called compatibilism. So in opposition to incompatibilism, which insists that there is this incompatibility between determinism and free will, compatibilists say that incompatibility is merely apparent, not real, that there actually isn't a fundamental conflict between free will and causal determinism. And we'll talk about that view later on. This is also sometimes referred to as soft determinism in contrast to hard determinism. And note, it's useful to see why this is. Why is determinism in the name here? It's because, again, compatibilists do not reject determinism. Like hard determinists, they say, yes, the universe is deterministic. But unlike incompatibilists and hard determinists, they think that that does not rule out our being free. In terms of thinking about the prospects for hard determinism, probably the most fundamental worry that people have about hard determinism is the worry that it forces us to give up some very fundamental aspects of our self-understanding, specifically in the domain of ethics. So probably the best known and most important argument against hard determinism is what's called the argument, or what I'll call here, the argument from responsibility, the argument from moral responsibility. Simple argument. It says if hard determinism is true, then we have no free will. It's just the position. Second, if we have no free will, then we can never be morally responsible for our actions. There's this idea that there's a fundamental connection between free will and moral responsibility. And the argument continues then with this third premise that we are morally responsible for at least some of our actions, that moral responsibility is not an illusion. So one way to argue against hard determinism is to say that moral responsibility is not an illusion, and therefore free will can't be an illusion either. And the reason for that is that moral responsibility requires free will, or rather, if free will is an illusion, then so is moral responsibility. But since moral responsibility is not an illusion, free will is not an illusion either. And that leads us to the conclusion that hard determinism is false.